Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled, How Do We Measure SEL? A Conversation with CASEL and Sanford Harmony. My name is Shayla Mulholland, and I'm the Director of Research and Program Development for Sanford Programs. I will be moderating today's webinar. I'm very happy to introduce our two presenters, Duncan Myers, CASEL's Senior Manager of Continuous Improvement, and Lindsay Reed, CASEL Manager of Research. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing the importance of evidence-based social emotional learning programs such as Sanford Harmony. Duncan will start our discussion off with a look at how we evaluate the effectiveness of SEL programs. Duncan has been at CASEL for 6 years and has overseen the review process for the CASEL program guide and was also one of the lead developers of the CASEL Guide for School-Wide SEL. As a senior manager for continuous improvement, he works with collaborating districts to plan and implement continuous improvement systems that drive successful SEL implementation in schools. We'll then hear from Lindsay on how we can use SEL assessments and the steps we can begin to take to apply specific assessment tools. Lindsay Reed manages CASEL's work on SEL assessment, specifically building educators' capacity to measure social and emotional learning through SEL assessments. She is helping with the creation of an assessment practice guide for educators to select and implement assessment tools according to their needs and as part of their SEL practice. Lindsay came to CASEL following work within the federal government and later as a consultant to improve the effectiveness of human services programs. Welcome, speakers. Duncan?
Great. Thank you, Shayla. Appreciate the introductions. And today we're really excited to talk with you all about the importance of evidence-based programs and an upcoming resource that during the second half Lindsay is going to talk about. So some of the objectives, like I said, are to highlight the importance of evidence-based programs, underscore why measuring student social-emotional competence is so critical for evidence-based programs, describe how student SEL assessments can benefit educators like many of the folks who are on the line with us today who are implementing SEL programs such as Sanford Harmony. And then at the end, we've got some time set aside for some Q&A to answer questions you have. And it's also a great opportunity for us at CASEL to gather input from all those that are participating on the call today. So before we get started, I do just want to take some time to define what we mean when we're talking about social and emotional learning. And just for the ease of communication, I'm just going to refer to that as SEL. So SEL is a process that CASEL believes is important for children, adolescents, and adults. It involves knowledge, skills, and attitudes around understanding yourself, understanding others, working towards goals and working on relationships, and making responsible decisions. So, and this is the wheel, as we kind of shorthanded refer to it here at CASEL. SEL, social emotional learning, involves strengthening 5 core competencies. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into each of these, but we have an overview of our wheel on our website at casel.org. But I did want to show this slide because we also think that SEL should be promoted and integrated across multiple levels of a school. So we're talking about implementing SEL in classrooms, and there could be SEL curricula or embedding SEL with academic instruction. Also, things that can go on throughout a school building. So across schools, adults can model social emotional competence, discipline policies and practice. We can make sure that they're instructive, restorative, and developmentally appropriate. And of course, we also want to have meaningful partnerships with families and community groups so we can really link student SEL with their home environment and with the broader community. So we believe SEL is important, and there's research evidence to back that up. So in 2011, there was a meta-analysis, and a meta-analysis really kind of combines findings from multiple research studies. You can see here that this meta-analysis really looked at outcomes across 213 different studies. And you can see in the outcomes at the bottom in the greens and the red boxes, we're seeing increases in things like student social emotional skills, improved attitudes, reduction in conduct, And at least from my perspective, one of the most helpful things about this study is you can see that the bottom bullet point there in the green box, we're really having a link to academic outcomes. So linking SEL with academic achievement. You know, for me, that's why this study from 2011 is one of the reasons it's so important. Just last year in 2017, that meta-analysis was updated. So they looked at the studies that actually collected follow-up data. You can see in that orange box, there was at least 82 programs, over 97,000 students, and they looked at outcomes 6 months up to 18 years after students were no longer participating in these programs. And they found that a lot of the benefits for students persisted over that time. So the reason I chose these two studies out of all the ones I could have picked from is that they really linked SEL to academic achievement, and also that students have long-term benefits from participating in these types of programs. So why does evidence-based SEL matter? That's a term that's thrown around a lot. It does mean different things to different people. But here at CASEL, we really view evidence-based programs as those that are, one, grounded in the research, so they do have evidence that they benefit students. They're grounded in SEL theory, so they're specifically designed to promote those competencies I was showing before, things like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills. And then that last box there is that they really do tie in principles of child and adolescent development. You can imagine that the way you want to promote social and emotional learning with kindergarten students is going to be different if you're working with high school students. You may be dealing with some of the same concepts, but high school students are at a little different level of sophistication than a kindergarten. Also, we think evidence-based programs are important because they really are in line with an act that was passed by the federal government back in December of 2015. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind as the main federal law for K-12 education. And although the act does cover a lot of important different areas, I did want to highlight that they encourage using evidence-based strategies and tie federal funding to using evidence-based programs. So I'll go back to ESSA in a little bit later, but again, wanted to highlight that even from the federal level, the importance of evidence-based programs is being stressed across our country. So the takeaway really for me is that evidence-based programs have a track record for promoting student outcomes. And we think it's important that we use those because at the end of the day, we want students to be successful in school and in life. So some of you may be wondering, well, where can I find evidence-based SEL programs? Well, since 2003, CASEL has been reviewing and rating evidence-based SEL programs. Those little graphics on the right-hand side of your screen, that one on the top there is Safe and Sound, and that's back from 2003. And since then, that has been updated. You can see there's two graphics. One is for a guide that came out in 2013, and that's for preschool and elementary programs. The other was released in 2015, and that's for middle and high school programs. I actually probably should have put the website up there. It's casel.org/guide. And you can see that although there's dates on there for 2013 and 2015, CASEL has been updating the programs that are in the guide. So in the last year, we added 12 new programs. One of those was Sanford Harmony. So Sanford Harmony is one of the evidence-based SEL programs that is in our guide. And here what I've done is just done a screen capture from our website. This is actually the list of preschool and elementary programs. You can see these are our programs that we've designated as select. That's our highest rating. And I'm going to highlight there's Sanford Harmony in that alphabetical list. So if you follow this link, you can check out the programs that met our criteria. And it has information on how those programs are designed, the different types of professional learning and implementation support that they offer. I've also got a link to our middle and high school programs. So if you have the time, I suggest you check out our website and check out those programs. Also, here's where I kind of relate back to ESSA, and the federal government has different levels of evidence. You can see that there's 4 tiers. Tier 1 is the strongest, and Tier 4 is the lowest. We often get questions at CASEL, and folks are asking, well, how does your guide relate to ESSA? Well, every program that's in our guide either meets criteria for that strongest tier or the moderate tier. So again, Sanford Harmony, since that is one of the programs in our guide, that meets one of the top 2 tiers that ESSA has put out for evidence-based programs. So some of you may also be asking the question, well, why is it important to measure SEL? Because you could make an argument that, well, all we have to do is go and use an evidence-based program and we could be good to go. But we actually think that measuring SEL is a very, very important part, not only of establishing an evidence base for a particular program, but also continuously improving how it's implemented. So that left-hand side in this little table here, if folks did not measure the impact of SEL programs, we wouldn't have any evidence-based programs because they would not have been able to establish that track record. So this can be done by looking at student outcomes, staff outcomes, climate outcomes, and also when it comes to folks that are already implementing programs, you want to assess the impact it's having on students so you can celebrate the bright spots where things are going well. You can also try to intervene in any areas you see where you might want to have more growth and improvement. And at the end of the day, you just want to ensure that SEL instruction is of high quality and making sure that students are receiving the most benefit that they can. So part of why this slide is important is, one of the things at CASEL is we field a lot of incoming requests that folks are just looking for some guidance around different aspects of SEL. And over the years, when we get questions about, well, hey, how should we be measuring SEL? What we've been able to do is really send people to different compendia out there, if you're familiar with that term, where it's kind of like a research-based overview of all the different assessment measures that are out there. And my background is research, so I even find them kind of hard to get through. So a lot of these compendia are clunky, they're really written for researchers, and whenever I would send them to folks that were curious, I would kind of give them the caveat that, hey, these things are kind of hard to wade through. So I'll leave you all with that and pass it to my colleague, Lindsay Reed, who right now is heading CASEL's effort to really make finding out how to measure SEL easier for educators so we don't have to send them to those clunky compendia that I was just talking about.
Great. Thank you, Duncan, for getting us here to the point of talking about what it means to measure social and emotional learning. And I'm just going to transition to talk about what I mean by measuring SEL in this context. And we're talking about student assessments. And what do student assessments provide us information about? Well, this sort of goes without saying, but I do want to make a point of it, that it tells us about, assessments can tell us about students' social and emotional development now and over time, so we can see whether progress has been made. It can help inform where districts and schools can invest SEL resources, for example, in professional development, in curriculum and programs, and how students are responding to social and emotional learning instruction. For example, student assessment data can help guide instructional decisions and make improvements and tweaks to programs. But one question we've been asking ourselves really is, do educators know how to measure SEL? This comes up because we recently got some data back from a nationally representative survey of principals, and it gave us some really interesting information about the interest among principals in social and emotional learning and their dedication to it, and also their awareness of how to do assessment. So you can see 99% of principals reported that they believe social and emotional skills are teachable in schools, but only 37% of them were familiar with the current assessments that are available, and 31% believed that teachers knew how to use data from assessments to improve their instruction. So these are two gaps in information that we really want to address. So what information do educators need to make progress on measuring SEL? This is not a complete set of questions, but just to get you thinking, they need information about what assessments are out there, which assessments are appropriate for their particular needs based on their local context, how to choose among available assessments. Many wonder about creating their own assessments or adapting one that another district or school is using. Wondering what should student SEL data not be used for, and how can we learn from others' experiences, those who have experience measuring SEL. So let's think about what student SEL assessments are for a moment, just to make sure we're on the same page. Student social and emotional learning assessments are measures of student intrapersonal and or interpersonal skills, knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and these should align with teaching objectives. So Duncan talked about the CASEL 5 cluster of competencies earlier. That includes like self-awareness, self-management, social awareness. Other examples are empathy and relationship building skills. Student social and emotional learning assessments like SEL are by definition strength-based and positively oriented. So we talk about competencies, skills, learning, and development. These are assessments that can be given to all students and are really focused on learning progression. By their nature, they are not designed to identify problem behaviors. They're not deficit-oriented. They're strengths-based. So what might an assessment look like? I'm going to give you an example in a moment, but first, a sense of what types of assessments are out there. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the most commonly talked about. So first we have surveys of students of their own social and emotional competencies. And these are usually valid for students in 5th grade or above, so not appropriate for younger students to fill out on their own. Teachers' observations of students' social and emotional competencies. These could be surveys or rubrics. Also direct assessments, which are not too common right now, but are being developed more and more and can be used with younger kids. These are assessments through which students can demonstrate skills through completing a challenging task. It could be a computer-based task. It could also be a project. So here's an example of a student survey for grades 5 through 12. This was developed by the Washoe County School District in collaboration with CASEL and is publicly available. So students are asked to rate each of these items based on how difficult or easy they are. So you can see the broad categories of competencies: self-awareness, questions about self-concept, emotion knowledge, and questions about social awareness. And in this particular survey, there's both a long form and a shorter form that's 17 items, which is what you see in parentheses there. So I want to take us through, just for a moment, through a thought exercise that's kind of working backwards. So I want you to imagine that you have already information on students' social and emotional competencies in front of you. And I want you to think about what you might be using those data for, what types of decisions. So one, if you think about formative assessment, classroom-based assessments, you can imagine perhaps making decisions using student data to inform instructional practices and decision-making. So this would be really more for teachers to consider tweaks in their daily instruction. The second, also focus more on teachers to use student data to help them facilitate conversations with students and families about students' social and emotional learning, and maybe how it fits into broader goals around academics and achievement. Going up a level to school and districts, making decisions around identifying SEL practices, supports, and resource needs. Perhaps using student data as part of efforts to evaluate the effectiveness of programs and practices. And being able to report at the aggregate level information about performance on social and emotional learning. So continuing through this thought exercise, you have your student data in front of you. Now imagine you're reflecting on it and trying to make meaning of it. So some questions to consider would be, from whose perspective is the data? So we talked about student perspective, from a teacher's perspective, it could be a direct assessment. What scope do the data cover? So imagine that you could have information based on different age groups. You could organize it by subgroups of interest. You'll be measuring certain specific SEL competencies that you've identified. So for example, if you have in front of you data presented by grade, it could cover preschool through 6th grade. It could measure competencies including empathy and relationship building, like in the Sanford Harmony program. Who's at the table with you when you're reflecting on these data? If you're a teacher, perhaps it's just you, or perhaps you're with a team of teachers, perhaps others. If you're a school or district administrator, perhaps you're with a leadership team, research and evaluation staff, SEL leads. There's any number of possibilities there, but it's just important to think about who would be who are the right folks to have at the table. And next, what other data might you have in front of you? For example, do you have information about the learning environment, school climate, student achievement, attendance, suspension data, SEL programs offered? And finally, what are the next steps based on the data you're seeing? So you want to think about how can you use the student data to actually help you make decisions about your SEL programming and continuous improvement efforts. Just a word of caution on some potential uses of student SEL data. One, we do not encourage using student SEL data for state accountability for high stakes decision making at this time. School climate measures may be more appropriate for this purpose. There was a Learning Policy Institute report that came out in 2017 that discusses this in detail. It's about SEL and accountability. And we are in agreement with the conclusions of that report. Another is we caution against over-focusing on student data because there are so many different ways that students learn social emotional skills, different factors that play into it. So it's important to have a balanced system of assessment to really understand how SEL programs and practices are working. We do not encourage the use of social and emotional learning data to screen and or refer kids for services, and similarly, not to measure problem behaviors. As we talked about, SEL assessment is by nature strengths-based and positively oriented, and there are other measures that are designed to detect problem behaviors, and they've been around for a long time and are more appropriate for that use. So I just want to summarize where we are at this point, and then we'll move on to the next discussion about an upcoming resource. So far, we've talked about student social and emotional competence in the following ways. We've talked about why to measure it, why we might not do more of it, what measures look like, and which purposes to use and not use the data for. So you might be wondering, how can we learn more about assessment? And we're going to talk next about an assessment guide. And I'm going to transition from my CASEL hat to the project that I'm working on, which includes a broader coalition of collaborating partners. So to take a step back just for a moment, the assessment guide that I want to introduce you to is a part of a project that we call in shorthand the assessment work group. The longer title is the work group to establish practical social emotional competence assessments of preschool to high school students. And we have a number of collaborating partners, including the core districts in California, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, RAND Corporation, Excel Labs, and Transforming Education. And we have a number of different funders that we're always grateful to help us do the work that we're doing. And that work includes the creation of an assessment guide for educators. So I want to talk about what that guide is. I will note that we're planning to launch this in the summertime. So it's not available yet, but we are developing the content for it, and I'm going to do my best to describe it here for you. So it's aimed at practitioners to solve some of the issues and questions that I talked about earlier. So to help practitioners select among available assessments that are currently in use, to learn from others that are experienced in doing social emotional learning assessment, and to help practitioners effectively use data for decision making. So what's in the guide? Well, the guide includes a categorized list of measures of student social and emotional competence, and the age range is pre-K through 12th grade. So we have a growing number of measures that are in the guide. The categorization is by purpose. And so that's one reason I took you through that thought exercise earlier, because that's really important to be thinking about as you're selecting a measure, and to think about what will I ultimately use the data for, what are the appropriate uses of these data, and how can that help me select a particular measure. So we have the categorization based upon those uses. And the version that's created now, we're calling it our beta version. We have 5 appropriate uses of assessment data, and within those, we categorize the measures. They can be, some of them can be used for more than one purpose. And there's let's see, I'm going to continue here. So we're also going to have some resources within the guide to answer practitioners' questions at different stages along the way. So if practitioners are early in their exploration of assessment, we'll have some resources to help guide them. If they're further along and they've already selected a measure, we plan to have resources to help them consider how to use the data. We also have plans to allow users to influence the content that's in the guide. For example, if you are using a measure or you're aware of a measure that's out there that you don't see in the guide, we'll have a platform to allow you to submit it for review. And also planning to have a forum for users to share information with one another. And this is related to the goal of helping practitioners connect with other users. We also plan to have the measures in the guide. We are planning to show how they're aligned with existing programs and frameworks. So if you're already using a framework like the CASEL framework, and you're already using a program like Sanford Harmony, how can you find a measure that aligns with the aims of those programs and frameworks? So that's the assessment guide. And there's another part of this assessment work that I think is really interesting and important to be aware of, and that is that there are a set of measures that already exist, and then there are assessments that are under development, and really what we see as the next generation of SEL measures. So most assessments that are available for use right now that would qualify for inclusion in the assessment guide are student or teacher reported measures, so mostly surveys. And we want to be able to also directly assess students' social and emotional learning. And that would just address some of the sort of inherent biases that come with student and teacher reports. There are both positives and negatives of any measure, any assessment. And I will just say that in the ideal world, you probably have data from multiple methods. And in any case, we want to make sure through this design challenge that I'm going to talk about that we're able to encourage the development of more direct assessments. And by doing that, to identify what might be the core elements of direct assessments and therefore share that information with potential developers out there to carry on in developing the next generation of SEL measures. So this design challenge is an annual competition. It's currently underway actually right now in its second year. And in the first year, we invited developers, the first year last year in 2017, we invited developers to submit direct assessments, and we rated them according to criteria such as how innovative they were, how clearly they provided information, how useful they were to practitioners, were they scalable, were they developmentally and culturally appropriate, and did they have strong technical properties. We learned through that first year that some of the most important elements of direct assessments were that they were relevant to the classroom, to the needs of classroom teachers, that they were practical to administer in a classroom setting, and that they were able to guide practice. So they provided data that could help teachers make decisions about the learning that happens in their classrooms. So what else did we learn in the first year? Really loud and clear, we learned that we needed more input from practitioners, and that was in part because of what I was just saying, that we need direct assessments that are able to guide decision making that's happening in the classroom. And so in the second year, we modified the design of the design challenge and applied what we learned from that first year. So we have a two-stage competition now where we're asking the question, what do practitioners need? So we put out a call to practitioners asking them what types of assessment, what are their assessment needs? And we selected 10 assessment needs among the set that were submitted. And we're using that as part of the second stage of this competition, where we're asking developers to address those specific needs that practitioners identified. The competition for developers to send us their assessment ideas began in late March, and the submissions are due in May. In case any of the folks on the phone are interested in submitting ideas or might know of somebody who has created or interested in creating an assessment, more information is available on the website, which you see our Measuring SEL website at the bottom of the screen. And there are a couple of ways that I would encourage you to stay engaged if you're interested in doing social and emotional learning assessment or improving the assessments that you already do. We have a website, like I said, and you can see it here. On the website, you can also find our collaborator network. This is a growing network of practitioners and researchers and others who are interested in assessment, It's already at about 1,500 people, so there's a large group of folks interested. They receive notifications of our weekly blog postings about assessment that engage authors from all over, not just within our work group. So it's a really interesting weekly blog read, in my opinion. And so I'd encourage you to join the Collaborator Network and check out our website and even think about submitting ideas to our design challenge. You can also learn about the results of last year's design challenge there as well. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll have some time for questions if folks have any. So I'll turn it back over to Shayla maybe to moderate the questions.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. That's right. So we're going to have some time for questions, and we do have some here. So I'll go ahead and read off a few questions. And this is for either Duncan or Lindsay. What are examples of some assessment resources that are helpful for early stages of the assessment process? So probably more for Lindsay here.
Yeah, there's one resource that I can recommend. It was published by the American Institutes for Research, AIR, and they have an assessment resource called Ready to Assess. And if you just Google AIR Ready to Assess, you should find that, and it's got there's a toolkit, and it will walk you through some early decisions, considering things like budget and capacity, and there's a decision tree that I think could be really helpful to folks. There's also a list of assessments that are categorized by different elements, such as the age group and the method of assessment. So that could be a good place to start.
Great. There's a question about, does Sanford Harmony collect data from programs that use their curriculum? This is actually a question I may be able to answer. We have collected data on programs that use Harmony, and working with evaluators have been able to look at the experience of using Sanford Harmony and also the implementation of the program. But we've also really worked in collaboration with schools and districts and their own data collection processes, and just try to provide those resources to support that assessment work. Right. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter your questions in the text box here for Duncan or Lindsay. The idea of the direct assessments are pretty cool. Do you have an example of one that either of you have found to be practical or innovative, an example of a direct assessment that you like?
That's a great question. So one thing I will say about the competition last year, and just in general on direct assessments, is that as a field, direct assessments in social and emotional learning, it's early, and there are a lot of great ideas out there, but the way that we designed our competition was to encourage even very early stage ideas that hadn't yet been implemented or piloted in schools. So, but I am aware, one of our collaborators, Clark McCown, he's on our assessment work group, has actually developed a direct assessment, and that's part of Excel Labs. And so that's one. It's for younger kids, I believe, maybe up to third grade, and it's a computer-based direct assessment where they go through a set of scenarios, and you can actually go through, I think there's a sample on the website of Excel Labs in case anybody's interested. For example, maybe you're on the playground at school, and somebody kicks a ball and it hits you in the face, and you have to give your response about how you would react to that. So it's testing a number of different skills.
Okay, another question. Is there an assessment that is designed for after-school programs?
Oh, that's a great question, and I didn't talk about this explicitly in the presentation, but the assessment guide will include assessments that are for both in-school and out-of-school time settings. And I can't give you an example of one specifically, but there is a resource that's on the tip of my tongue. I think it's called Thrive. You might try Googling Thrive SEL, and the Susan Crown Exchange. They produced a resource on out-of-school time that may have some information on assessment in out-of-school time. And the Weichert Foundation is another place you could check out because they work in out-of-school time settings.
Yeah, I would also recommend looking at Weichert. They have what's called the YPQI, the Youth Program Quality Index. It is related to implementation, and it is specific to out-of-school time settings. So yeah, Weichert Foundation is another good one to check out for out-of-school time.
Yep.
Are there any other ways that you'd like to talk about how CASEL is supporting assessment work with districts? And this question is for Duncan, with respect to continuous improvement.
Certainly. So I think, Shayla, in your comment about whether Sanford Harmony, collects data in the districts they work with, we have somewhat probably a similar approach where when it comes to trying to inform continuous improvement, so really improving the way that SEL is implemented across the district, what we often first do is what are schools already collecting? So even things like attendance, sometimes there's a focus on discipline, of course, although sometimes people can get a bit blinders on with just discipline. There are, some districts collect climate data, not a lot, but some also collect data on, student social emotional competence. Lindsay mentioned Washoe County and Reno, Nevada, where they have developed a measure. So what we first start with is what are they already collecting? And then trying to find out how do we have ways where we can convene stakeholders, educators, school leaders, district leaders, families, students when appropriate, and how do we get together as a group and learn from what the data are showing us? So it's kind of a general approach, Shayla, but what data are they already collecting? Is it meeting their needs, and do they need to add measures to better get at student social emotional competence, which when it's ready, the Measure SEL guide will be, I think, very critical for that. And then how do we get it so that we can learn from it in systematic ways and convene the right people to really, what is it identifying we should do? Where should we intervene to really try to promote things that are going well?
That's great. Thank you so much, Duncan. And that actually wraps up our time for question and answers. But I want to also let everyone know that there's a handout available with some more information about the CASEL guide and the Sanford Harmony program in that guide. And we also have a survey we'd love for everyone to complete. We'd really appreciate your feedback on this webinar, what you learned, and any thoughts that you have. So if you could just take a moment to complete that survey. And a big thank you to our speakers again, to Duncan Myers and to Lindsay Reed. So are there any last thoughts that you'd like to share, or any last words?
I'll just give another plug for joining our collaborator network, because we would really love to have a broader set of practitioners engaged in our assessment work.
And I would just want to plug our program guide. That's a resource that is viewed the most on our website. It's viewed over 35,000 times on average per month. And there is a list of evidence-based programs, including Sanford Harmony, if you want to learn more about the evidence-based approaches that meet CASEL's criteria.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.